Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Sunoikis's Digital Classics. Today we have our 9th session of our program, and the session of today is about name entity recognition and prosopography. And the two guests today are Gabriel, Bodard, and myself. We have been working a lot on prosopography and name entity recognition, and so this is the reason why we decided to include also in this term a session about these topics, because we have been producing a lot of data, and in any case, they are part of our program. So we had sessions before, but today we decided again to talk about these topics. And today we also have in our room in StreamYard, Chiara Palladino from Ferma University and Dimitar Ilyev. We are happy to have them because we can have a discussion about these topics, and so they can ask questions. But of course, as usual, we have people on YouTube, so your audience is on YouTube. So please, if you are following us, please ask questions in the chat, because we can read your questions, and so we will be able to answer your questions after the end of our presentation. And as usual, the description of this session is in GitHub, in the page of the class outline, including readings and also two exercises. But I think we can start with Gabriel, and also this session is a part of a group of sessions about name entities. Last week we had a session with Janne Brooks about Trismegistos people, and we already mentioned last week the lexicon of Greek personal names and other resources that we are going to present and to discuss today. But now, please, Gabby, I think, and okay, I can add your screen to the stream. Okay.
Great, thank you, Monica. Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to give the sort of introductory half of this, and then Monica's going to present some more sort of research applications, specifically digital research applications of some of this work. So I'll give a bit of definitions and introduce a bit of the scholarship, the history of scholarship in this area, including some very recent history. So the outline of the three things I'm going to talk about very broadly is a quick definition of prosopography. And that's a word that we sometimes use as if it were a real word that people use in the English language, whereas there are actually a very small number of people, less than 1/100th of 1% of native speakers of the language, who have actually ever heard the word before. So let's, but also slightly less flippantly, it's a word that has a very specific definition that we sometimes use as if it were a much broader word. And so, I'll talk a bit about the issue we have there. So I'm going to vacillate between using the technical definition of prosopography and using prosopography as a shorthand for a person database, a data set containing information about historical people, which is only part of the definition. And then I'm going to give examples of two specific projects, and then I'll hand over to Monica. So firstly, this is a very useful definition of prosopography from a short manual published in 2007 as part of a volume on historical prosopography. And what this makes clear is that that prosopography is a way of collecting biographical and other kinds of information about historical persons, including onomastic information, date information, geographical information, in a consistent way, so as to be able to make generalizations across it. And this is a definition of that's describing the way prosopography has been done since the 19th century, and I think this is still consistent with the way we do prosopography now. And the key word that I want to pull out of this definition on the screen, which I'm not going to read out or go through in any more detail than this, is this word here, questionnaire. What they mean by this, and what people have understood by this for a long time, as we'll see with a couple of my examples, is having a consistent set of questions that you answer for each person in your data set. So rather than just taking one person and getting everything you know about them, you say, well, what do we want to know about people? We want to know their name, their titles, their job descriptions, their dates, their locations, events in their life, various other things like this. And so you have this. The questionnaire is a word which works in both the digital and the pre-digital context. In the digital context, we might, rather than questionnaire, we might say database, right? Or database field, or table, or spreadsheet. It's something that has a consistent set of fields that we want to answer for each person in our data set. So one example, probably one of the earliest and most important prosopography, certainly for classics, the Prosperography of Imperial Rome. Each entry in the data set looks something like this. It's a print prosopography. It has a paragraph of prose in Latin, of course, which has various information in it. And that information, although it looks fairly dense, is actually structured according to a questionnaire. So it has, the person has an identification number, they have a name, they have a title or potentially more titles, they have date information attached, there's bibliographical references and quotations. And it's a summary of this person's life as we know it, and their life defined as effectively their CV, right? Their cursus honorum, and so forth. So this is an example of what we mean by that. So this is not quite what we would imagine as a database, but it's using that, and it could certainly be expressed in a database, right? We could easily cut this up and put it into a database, which is the way digital prosopographies would be handled, or other digital data sets with information about historical people in. If you go to the digital version of the PIR, in fact, you'll find there's a very limited amount of information available, because the books are sold on paper, and they're extremely expensive, and they are what we expect, what they expect people to make their income from, and so forth. But it contains a subset of that information in what is clearly a structured form, right? It has their name at the top there. It has information no longer in, or no longer entirely in Latin. There's German is the default language. There's the reference. So PIR R100 is the same information that we get at just 100 in the margin there. PIR is default. That's the beginning of the identifier of every single person in the PIR, and it begins with R because this is in the chapter R, because that's the first letter of the person's name, and I think it's Regulus that's the name we're interested in there. And importantly, there is this identifier here, identifier 11467, which is a machine readable. This is a URI. A universal resource identifier for this person that you can use both to identify this entry in the PIR and to identify Rossius Regulus, the person. So it serves as double function, and you can make digital statements about Rossius Regulus using this identifier as a proxy for this person's identity. And note that you can it offers you the opportunity to download this information for each person one at a time, either as plain text or as JavaScript object notation. So you can take it and you can process it digitally from there. And this is therefore a machine actionable set of data. Even though it's not the full data from the printed books, it's still very useful information in terms of generating a person database. Here's just another bibliography, another prosopography rather, the PCBE, Prosopography chrétienne du Bas Empire, which is a more recent prosopography. It's slightly more structured information. You can see that the person's name is at the top left, the date is given on the top right, and although this may look like fairly, sort of human readable free text, the fact that there are dots both before and after that date means that this is neither the person's date of birth nor their date of death, but it is a date during which that must have happened during their life. So it's a floruit date, if you like. There's a title on the first line. There's a block of text giving you that summary of their life, which includes date information. and other information such as titles and geography, and then the references are given below with these little footnote numbers. So it's more structured information. If you had to write a script to extract that text into a database, it would be easier to do it from this sort of layout than it would be from the PIR layout, which is just a paragraph of text where you'd need full, named entity recognition would have to do all the work for you. Here, the page structure can do some of that work for you. There is not currently a digital version of the PCBE, however. Another person data set, which I'm now switching to using that name because this is not strictly speaking a prosopography, because this doesn't contain biographies of the individuals, even very, very abbreviated ones, but does contain some prosopographical information, is the Lexicon Greek Personal Names. This started out as non-masticon, so a database of names rather than a database of persons, but each name is broken up into the individuals that the name refers to. So you see under Xenon, it doesn't just give you information about Xenon as a name, it also gives you information about what on this screen at least are the first 10 people called Xenon from this volume of the Lexicon Greek Personal Names that are attested. And so this is much more structured information. I mean, we'll come back to the lexicon a bit more later. But you can see that if you see the digital form of this, which is the digital data from which the print volume that we see in the first scan there was generated, is in fact tabular data in the source data, and this web presentation of that same tabular data is given below. And as I say, I'll come back to this and we'll look more closely at this in a minute because I want to use that as my key example. Just want to talk very briefly about two other models for encoding prosopography digitally now. And the first of these is the Factoid model. This is something that has been in development for about the last 20 years or so by scholars originally from the Department of Digital Humanities at King's College London, although that's sort of dispersed a little around the world since. And this is a model where prosopography is encoded with the source information about each piece of information about that person being the key information, that being the core data. So rather than you having a database with one record per person, instead you have one record per statement about people that occurs in whatever your source or list of sources are. So this statement might say, on the year, whatever, it's part of a narrative, King Harold was crowned at some location. And this is the source for several pieces of information. It's the source for the date, it's the source for the person's name, it's the source for the person's identity, it's the source for an event in their life, and it's a source for the location of that event. So all sorts of information can come out of that source, but the source is the core of the data set. And so you can then, by taking all the sources that mention a particular person, that have been identified as mentioning a particular person, you can extract from that a table of persons, and for each person, you have multiple sources. And by centering it on the source, or what they call the factoid, you can have sources that contradict one another, sources that are patently untrue, sources that scholars do not believe or agree with, and you can have people that scholars don't believe ever existed, because what you're actually recording is people who are attested in the sources, which may or may not be true. And you can make statements, you can include commentary and say, we think this part is false, these two are contradictory, clearly this author is more reliable than the other, all that sort of thing. But it's a different way of thinking about prosopography, and that's the way that that model chooses to really center that kind of prosopography. There's various things that can be done with that model. And the last model I want to talk about is using TI-XML, which we've talked about in Sunoikisis before, and this XML language also has a module that's called Personography. I think they decided the word prosopography was too unfriendly and people didn't understand it enough, so they then instead invented a new word that nobody knows what it means, which I feel was not an improvement. But in any case, they have this module called Personography, and this enables you to encode in hierarchical XML the same sort of information that you'd include in one of these person databases that we've seen, or indeed the factoid kind of information that we've seen in the other model. And this is done. It's slightly more clunky than a database if you're trying to encode complex information in lots of relations. But if what you want is a simple text box for each person, it's very easy to generate it from that information. And in this example, we've got a person-centered piece of information, but we could indeed organize the entire person database by event or by reference instead of by person. And all of these make it possible to talk about prosopography as a set of data which are effectively links to other data. And this is really central to all of the data models, in particular the factoid prosopography model that I talked about. There's no actual prosopography there until you are able to generate links from the various pieces of information in there. So because each source snippet has links to persons and links to names and links to events, it is those links that that create the structured data and that create the prosopography. So there has been a movement, and this is again something I'll talk about a bit more in a minute, to think about how to express digital person data about historical person data more broadly than just prosopography as linked open data. And this is the Snapdragon Project, which I'll talk about in more detail. But what this effectively does is that it allows you to attach any of these 9 pieces of data to a person record, which includes linking them to each other and linking them to other data sources for place, for people, for names, for bibliography, for titulature, for vocabulary, and for other kinds of identifiers that persons can have. And this enables you to do more than just have your own data create available in your publication, in your data record, but to have all sorts of other data that might be in the other sources that you have linked to, or that have linked to you, be available for users to find and search and query and so forth. And I'll talk more about how we did that and how we thought that worked when I come to that project. So going back to the lexicon Greek personal names, I wanted to talk about this project a bit because this is a very complementary project to Trismegistos, which was talked about last week. And the main difference between them is the lexicon Greek personal names is really name-centered, and so they start from the name and then they say, well, okay, we've got 30 instances of this name. How many people does that represent? And if that turns out to be about 20, then they group them together and they give you identifiers for each one. But it's the name that they're really focusing on. And the reason they have location information and date information is primarily because they want to be able to talk about the geographical distribution of names and the chronological development of names across the Greek world. The fact that they also give us person identifiers is really useful for those of us who are interested in personal names as an element of prosopography, but the lexicon is not in its essence a prosopography. So just a bit of history of the LGPN. It's a very old project as digital projects go. It collects Greek names, as the name suggests, which includes names of Greek people, whatever language they might be written in, and names of people of whatever origin written in Greek in the original sources, with the exception, I think, of Roman trianomina written in Greek, which they initially left out. I don't know if they've started including those. It's a project that has been very successful because it allowed itself to be responsive to newly developing technologies. So it began as a card catalog. They had shoe boxes full of little cards with the information on, and they were sorted by hand. And very quickly became a database, which they decided to keep simple. So it was basically a plain text database. That evolved through things like vocabularies into a relational database, but very quickly, in fact, evolved into its current form, which is into TIXML encoded set of person data. This is in the process of further evolution. We don't know what its next incarnation is going to be. It's currently still in TIXML, but they are very, very open to further migrating the data if other formats come along. They've also been using linked open data for this for quite a long time, and they've been part of the Snapdragon project that I'll talk about in a moment. It's been driven basically a volume at a time by individually funded projects, by collaborations with other projects, by contributions from scholars working on certain things. And the latest incarnation of it that is currently under development involves more openness in terms of the data, more transparency about open licensing of the data, an API to make it easier for other projects to engage digitally with the data, beyond what's available via website search in the current form. And they're thinking about a data format and interface to enable more contribution from other projects in the future. What's quite clear is that collaboration in creating a new volume is possible and is convenient, but that improvement to volume 1, which is now 40 years old or so, is much more difficult to find external funding for, and so has to be part of an ongoing process rather than a one-off expensive funded project. So this is the screenshot I showed before, of both a snippet from the print volume and a snippet from the current website. And what I wanted to highlight on this now is this final field, which is a field called references, which originally contains bibliographical information, as you can see, but also contains further information, and this information is slightly more disambiguated than the underlying data, but only slightly more. But you'll see some of these are bibliographical references, so LEG 541019.3. But in the second example, we see also that the name Xenon in the original source is partially restored. The zeta of that name is not on the stone. It's been restored by the editor. In the fourth example, we see, in addition to bibliographical information, we also see family relationships. We see that this person called Xenon was the son of Artemidorus and the father of Zenobios. So this is starting to be prosopographical information, right? We're starting to get information about family relationships and so forth. We already have information that this person is from Aphrodisias and roughly the date of the person. So this is starting to build up more information that looks like prosopography. We already heard last week that LGPN and Trismegistos have been collaborating on the Greco-Egyptian names. It's worth noting that the Trismegistos is a database of references and texts, and LGPN is basically an onomasticon, but with disambiguation of individual persons in it. And so this collaborative work, which is merging their current data, and is then going to have to be separated out into data which has different agendas and therefore may be potentially inconsistent with one another again, is going to be a really interesting process to see. On the Snap project, which again I'll talk about a little bit more in a second, 98% of the records in Snap were made up of LGPN and Trismegistos records, about 350,000 records each, and a trivial amount of records from other data sets. We had a quick first pass to see how many people might turn up in both LGPN and Trismegistos, which we expected to be low because LGPN had not yet done a volume on Egypt, and Trismegistos was almost entirely focused on Egypt up until that time. But on the first pass, we already found 1,000 overlaps, and that was just things that were easy to find because they actually cited the Prosopographica Ptolemaica in the bibliography of the LGPN, and that was one of the sources of Trismegistos, as Jana told us last week. So this is quite interesting already that there is that small number of overlaps just from a very, very simple search. It's also worth noting that Egypt is by far the largest single data set in the LGPN. It will be the largest data set in the LGPN simply because the papyrological sources mean we know about many, many, many more people in Egypt than we do in any other province. of the ancient Greek world. So very briefly, the Snapdragon Project, the aim of the Snapdragon Project, of which this is a mock-up of what a person record ought to look like, was effectively to try to come up with standard identifiers for ancient persons. There not being a single prosopography of the entire ancient world, and the vast majority of the many prosopographies of small parts of the ancient world not being in digital form and therefore not offering identifiers. Those that do are have very small overlaps, as we saw between LGPN and Trismegistos, but not none. So, how do we align identifiers so that if I make a statement about person X in Trismegistos and someone else makes a statement about person Y in the LGPN, we can say that they're the same. The two statements are about the same person. And this project at the time worked by ingesting data from various data sets and various projects, and the demise of the project, if I can be dramatic about it, was that it's very hard to find funding for infrastructure. I mentioned that the LGPN was funded as a result of several different funded projects, collaborative or otherwise, for individual parts of it, to try and get funding to build a permanent project that would hold all of this stuff together would be very hard, and in our case has proved impossible. So the LGPN is no longer funded. Its most recent attempt to be funded, which was a last-ditch attempt to stop it from dropping off from dropping off the end of its web hosting agreement, has failed. So the website will soon disappear. Which is not the end of the idea of Snapdragon, but it's the end of the website of the project. And so yes, that problem with infrastructure funding is really the issue there. I know someone has just asked a question on YouTube. What do I mean by disambiguator here? That might have been asked a few minutes ago. When I talk about disambiguating between persons, I think I may mention that in a couple of slides' time, and maybe I'll explain it in. I'll try to explain it better there than I did when I mentioned it last time. So this is just a list of things we wanted to do with Snapdragon. I see I'm being a little bit short of time, so I won't go in this in great detail. But among the things we really wanted to be able to do was produce unique identifiers for individual ancient persons, including identifying people between different source data sets, and to use this data set to ask new research questions. And again, I'll come back to that. The current status is we aggregated 5 data sets, 700,000 records, the vast majority of them being Trismegistos and the LGPN. We have partial person pages. You see a link there to a sample one. If you go to that page, you'll see person number 1 in the data set, and you'll see that the web page is slightly broken, doesn't look as nice as the mock-up that I showed a few slides ago. And also, if you're watching this after September 2021, you may find that page is completely gone. Likewise, the second link to the Sparkle endpoint, which is the really non-user-friendly way of querying the Snap data. I put an exercise on the GitHub page for this Sunoikis session, which asks you to look at some documentation and figure out how to use that Sparkle endpoint to do a simple query to find some person information. And I do that not out of sadism, but more as a sense of showing that it is possible to query in that way, but that no human would ever want to, and that we really need a better interface for that. So the fact that Sparkle endpoint is also going to disappear sometime in late 2021 is not a great tragedy. There is, however, an ontology, that is to say, a set of information on how to encode prosopographical information and data exported from person databases in linked open data, and there is this cookbook which explains what we want that linked open data to look like, and those are the core outputs. Those are much more important than the data we actually produce. The information on how people can go ahead and use this data in future is actually the important output of this project, and that has been used. The rest of the database, the rest of the project outputs have been moribund since 2015. The guidelines are still being used. So my final point, and this is where I will get to try and disambiguate a little bit better, is why would we use linked open data on person information of this kind? And one reason is to help us to understand where two references to ancient persons, whether these are references in source texts or references in two different databases or prosopographies, refer to the same person, or whether they refer to different people. So if we have two references, perhaps in the same inscription, both to somebody by the name of Alexander, do we consider those to be co-references? Is the same Alexander being referenced twice? Or do we need to disambiguate them by saying, well, one is this Alexander and the other is his grandson, Alexander? A lot of Greeks, for example, would be named after their grandfathers, and so you'd have that potential ambiguity. So disambiguating means deciding which persons are referred to by any given name, set of names, which is the first task of any prosopography. You know, we have a text which contains 4,000 name references, which, depending on what sort of a text it is, might be multiple references to each of only a few hundred people, or might, if it's an epigraphic corpus, 4,000 name references are likely to be only about 3,900 people, because people reoccur multiple times very, very seldom. When you have that sort of disambiguation and that sort of record of the citations and the references to persons, you can then start to have this network of citations. What texts, when do multiple texts cite the same person? What sorts of relationships between persons can we extrapolate from that text? How can we ask new questions by querying this graph, looking for new patterns? What would be really nice as well to be able to do with this linked open data would be to record the scholarly discussion around this data, how we came to the decision that this is one Alexander and not a different Alexander, and that this Alexander was the grandfather of that other Alexander, and so forth. Which scholars maybe disagree with that? What primary sources and secondary sources can we cite to tell us more information? And we also need to think of what is the workflow for adding new person records, including potentially thousands at a time from a whole database to this graph of information. Doing this with linked open data means that one person or one project doesn't have to do all the work. If there are several projects doing it in compatible ways, then someone can come along later when those projects have long disappeared and the Snapdragon website has gone down, but the raw data behind it is in GitHub, and several people have taken copies of it and adapted it for their own ends and re-uploaded it in different places. And so the data still exists because it's in this compatible format, and it's in this linked format that is open data, open licensed, using open standards, and referencing to other projects and other sources of data within that data, which is in a nutshell the essence of linked open data. So that's a bit of the background. I'll hand over to Monica now to talk a bit more about some of her interest in prosopographical data and named entity recognition. Can I just ask the person who asked, were you happy with what we meant by disambiguate and disambiguator after my latest explanation? I know there's a time lag, so maybe Monica, you can start while we're waiting for them to answer.
Okay, excellent. Yes, I see that there is an answer to your answer. Okay, so in this part I will talk a bit about name entity recognition, which is connected to onomastics and prosopography, because of course, if we want to study on ancient onomastics and prosopography, first of all, we have to identify ancient names to look for these names. And today, in the digital world, the situation is that we have resources, we have authority lists for ancient names. In this case, I mean mainly Greek and Latin. Latin, but we still miss data, also because most of the data we have are still in Latin or in modern languages. And today, name entity recognition is an interesting task, as you can see from this slide of information extraction, to try to identify names in our data. Name entity recognition is a well-known task, it's part of NLP, and as you can see in this a definition that we can accept. So the goal is to identify different name entities, and they belong to many different categories, not only proper names, but also quantities of interest, people, places, organizations, time expressions, monetary amounts, etc., etc. So of course, name entity is a big group, and today name entity recognition is applied to many different corpora, especially for contemporary languages, mainly English, and text of different nature. But for ancient Greek and Latin, what do we have today? Can we use name entity recognition? And we have projects. Today, I'm trying to summarize a bit the state of the art today for name entity recognition for ancient Greek and Latin. We have mainly projects for Latin, for example, the Herodotus project, which is offering now a tagger for Latin. We have experiments in Recogito, and we will talk about Recogito next week, where we find a beta support for Latin, because in Recogito we have automatic name entity recognition, but for modern languages, so for translations of classical sources into modern languages. And then we have other resources. For example, here I'm mentioning the Classical Language Toolkit, which is a tool for using NLP techniques for historical languages, so not only for Greek and Latin, but for other historical languages, including Greek and Latin. And the problem is that we still miss annotated text and models for identifying name entities in, especially in Greek. We already talked about name entity recognition in past sessions of Sunoikis Digital Classics, and here in this slide I'm giving you the links to those sessions. And today I would like to focus on a project I've been working on, which is fortunately now funded by the DFK here in Germany, and where I'm trying to use name entity recognition for a specific subset of ancient names, which means names of ancient authors and also the titles of ancient works. But here, just a few slides. Well, in this case, we can see Recogito. Within Recogito, it's possible to have an automatic name entity recognition using the Stanford Core NLP for modern languages, English, French, German, and Spanish, but there is also beta support for Latin using the Herodotus tagger. And other experiments, we did something in the past here in Leipzig for a project about the ancient Greek historians, aligning ancient Greek and translations of Greek into Latin, the Latin used by scholars in the 19th century. This is an example of the alignment between a fragment of an ancient Greek historian in ancient Greek and the Latin translation. And in this case, this collection of fragments is interesting because we have short text full of personal and geographical names. And by aligning this text with the Latin translation, we can immediately identify with different strategies proper names, and by aligning them, then we can disambiguate them. But the second aspect for name entity recognition is represented also by authority lists and knowledge bases, because of course to perform name entity recognition we need training data, we need a first set of data. And today, especially for ancient Greek, what do we have? We already mentioned the lexicon of Greek personal names for for personal names. We have also other resources like the Pleiades Gazetteer for geographical names, for place names. We have Trismegistos people, and here you can see the link to the session of last week, where we had a full presentation of Trismegistos people, and also the new version of it, and then other resources like Snapdragon that was presented before by Gabriel. And then we also have other resources that are not projects in digital classics, but resources where we can find proper names, name entities in the original language, like the Virtual International Authority file, Dbpedia, and Wikidata. And I'm going to show you the use of these resources because they are interesting, because we begin to find names, for example, for ancient Greek in these resources, more than in other resources that we have for digital for projects in classics and in digital classics. But again, so today I would like to focus on a subset of name entities. So basically the focus is to work on names of ancient authors, personal names, and also connected to these titles, descriptions of ancient works that can be part of name entities. And in this slide, I have an example of a text in ancient Greek with a translation into English, where we have ancient author names and titles. In this case, this is a passage from the Deipnos Office of Athenaeus, and we have a reference to this author Archestratus in red. So in red, we have different names in this passage, but the reference is, the quotation is from this Archestratus of Syracuse or Gela. So there is a discussion in antiquity about the place where this author was coming from. And then we have a reference to different titles of his work. We have in blue, so 4 different titles. So for his work, different authors in the past were using different titles, which is something that we find in antiquity. So titles in antiquity were not fixed as today, and it happens many times that we find different titles or descriptions for the same work. In any case, we in this text, with these 3 colors in red, in green, and in blue, we find different entities, in the sense that we have the names of authors: Archestratos, Chrysippos, Lynceus, Callimachos, Clearchos. Then we have adjectives referring to the place of origin of Archestratos, and then in blue we have different titles. And basically we can identify them because in the text, in modern editions, the first letter of these words is a capital letter. But this is an example of the entities I'm interested in. Of course, we have resources in traditional printed editions for extracting this information. This is an example of the Index Scriptorum of the edition of the Deipnos Office by Gabriel, where we have in this page, you can find this edition in Internet Archive, and on the page on the left here, you can see the name of Archestratus with a typo also, and below, of course, you can see the places where this author is mentioned in the Deipnos Office. And this list, the Index Scriptorum, is a sort of disambiguated list. So we can again use the term disambiguation, because in this case we have an index only with author names, not in general names of ancient people, but author names. So we know that in this list, these names are names of ancient authors. And also the structure of these pages is the usual structure of indices of critical editions, where we have different paragraphs, we have indentation, and then the main, the entry is written in Latin, in this case not in ancient Greek, in the nominative, and so we can easily identify the name. And this is the structure for our author Archestratus. In this case, and I'm sorry, I know that the slide is quite small, the text, but this is another resource where we have okay, the digital version of the Loeb classical library. Here I think that you can see the text is a bit bigger, where we have, okay, the last edition of the date office, and again we have at the end of these volumes we have an index. In this case, the index is not only an index of ancient authors, but in general an index of personal names mentioned in the dates office, where we find the name of Archestratus, here, not in Greek again, in English in this case, with other elements, okay, he's defined as gastronomic poet. And then below, we see the passages where this author is mentioned. But now I go back to my slides, if I can find them again, sorry. Okay, here we are. Then, for authors, so if our focus now is starting from onomastics, we focus on a subset, which is a subset of author names. Again, do we have authority lists today for ancient author names? Well, we have lists for, and here I'm referring to Greek authors. And in fact, we have resources like the TLG, the canon of the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae for ancient Greek authors. We have the Perseus catalog, and then other resources where we can find okay, ancient Greek names. I'm referring in this case to resources about Greek. There are other resources, for example, for Latin. I'm not mentioning them in this slide. For example, the Digital Latin Library today is producing a catalog for Latin authors, but now my focus is on Greek. And so we have these resources where we can find in a digital format ancient author names, even if there are still problems, because usually these resources include the form not in ancient Greek, but in Latin or in other modern languages. And an example, okay, is the TLG, where we have now the online canon. I'm still looking at the author mentioned before, Archestratus. This is the entry in the canon of the TLG, where, as you can see, the form is in Latin, not in ancient Greek. We have the name of the author, then an adjective referring to the genre of this author, and other metadata like the chronology of the author, and then also other adjectives referring to the place of origin, or possibly the places of origin of this author. Then the TLG, as you know, includes editions of the text. In this case, Archestratus is a fragmentary author, which means that the texts of Archestratus are lost. We have only quotations and reuses in other sources. We have fragmenta, as they are called in philology, and the TLG lists the editions from which the texts are taken in the TLG. And then the TLG includes also identifiers. In this case, Archestratus is identified as author 1175, so we have a 4-digit number for the author, and then after the dot we have 3 numbers that are used to refer to the text, or better, to the editions included in the TLG. So this is just to see how data for authors are in the TLG. Then we have the Perseus catalog. We have an entry about Archestratus. In this case, again, we have an entry in embedding also TLG numbers. In this case, the identifier is expressed in a different way because the Perseus catalog used the CTS architecture. And as you can see, within the URN, we have the number of our author Archestratus, and then in the entry, we have in the Perseus catalog other metadata, ingesting metadata from different resources, not only from the TLG. But we have other resources where we can find information about ancient authors. As I was saying before, the Virtual International Authority file is an example where we have also classical authors, Greek authors, like Archestratus, because the Perseoscatol is contributing to the Virtual International Authority file. In this case, we can look for the author in modern Greek, not in ancient Greek, but still we get data, metadata, as you can see, in different languages, because the BIAF ingests data from different resources. And then we have a resource like Dbpedia, which is interesting because this is a knowledge base where we have also a section about ancient Greek authors, and in this case you have the example and you have the link, you can look at it, where we have an entry about Archestratus. And the good thing is that Dbpedia is ingesting data from Wikipedia and other resources, but we find the form of the author in ancient Greek, which is something that, for example, is missing in other philological resources like traditional indices, or, for example, the TLG canon, or also the Perseus catalog. So, for example, Dbpedia is interested, like Wikidata. Wikidata, which is a project part of Wikipedia, connected to Wikipedia, and we have an entry about Archestratus, and within the entry we also have the Greek form of the author, at least the lemma, which is important, and we will see later why. And also in Wikidata, this author has a specific identifier. We have this number, in the URL. But now, to show a few examples, my interest, my idea is to begin to extract data about ancient author names and work titles in the original language, in Greek, starting from different texts. Mainly I'm working now on the Dapnosophist, but I'm expanding the work also to Prosopography and to the Suda, because these are important sources where we have many references to ancient Greek authors. And the first part of the work, this is to show a concrete problem. So if we want to extract these names, where do we find them? How can we identify them and possibly disambiguate these names? In this case, the example is the work done on the Dapnosophist. In this case, you have numbers, just to have an idea about this work. In 15 books, the number of tokens, the number of paragraphs and sentences of this work, according, of course, to the philological work done in the past centuries. The work is arranged in books, and now we have paragraphs and sentences, which are important for our work, because my work originally was to tokenize the text, to extract capitalized words, because in critical philological editions, proper names, and by proper names I mean personal names, geographical names, and also work titles, are capitalized. So this is a basic method used in name entity recognition to begin to extract name entities from a text. So I extract the capitalized words, removing non-relevant words, and then we can talk about that later. And then I lemmatize these tokens, because thanks to the lemma, I can produce an authority list, but I can also query external resources for a first form of disambiguation, again, because in this case you can see, so I could extract in general name entities, but when I have all these name entities, of course, we have to disambiguate them if they are personal names, author names, place names, or other forms. And this is, these are numbers specific for the Dapnosophist. And in this case, I have data just to have a sense of what we have now. So from the text of the Dapnosophist, we can extract these name entities belonging to different classes and subclasses. In the first column, I'm using these abbreviations. They are generic name entity classes used in many other projects, in general in computational linguistics and NLP. So I decided to start with big categories. like place names, organizations, personal names, and other, which is a big group. And within these groups, as you can see, we can identify subclasses starting from place names. Then we have many other cases like festivals and Panhellenic games that, as for now, are in a category org. And then other, including, for example, constellations, currencies, languages, groups, etc. And then personal names. But of course, personal names include many different people, like gods, persons, personifications, and also authors. Okay, so this is to show how we can go step by step. And again, going back to the question about the disambiguation, this is an example. So the first step was to identify name entities, then to try to get a first level of disambiguation, at least among locations, personal name, persons, and organizations, and another big group of other entities. And then within these subclasses to further disambiguate, for example, personal names. You can find data in a resource I've been working on, the Digital Atheneums project, which is online. And for example, for our author Archestratus, in this case, we can see the results. So this is a resource. We have a digger, which is a resource where you can search inflected forms and lemmata of name entities extracted from the Dapnosophist. And through the lemma, which is, of course, fundamental, we can interrogate external resources. I'm using the example of the author Archestratus. You can see here, so we have the name. In this case, is Archestratus, but also in the Dapnosophist, we have other occurrences of this name not corresponding to the ancient author Archestratus. So this is another level of disambiguation, and Gabriel before was mentioning this, okay, for Alexander or for the city Alexandria. And as for now, we can see, so the lemma, through the lemma in ancient Greek, I can interrogate external resources like logeion, okay, the dictionary, and in fact, through this, I can, for example, get information about the name Archestratus in logeion, and we know that in dictionaries is difficult to find proper names, or at least we have not many proper names, which is another problem for us today, and this is the reason why we don't have enough data. Personal name in the lexicon of Greek personal names, in this case, through the lemma, I can automatically query the LGPN that was shown before by Gabriel. And as for now, we don't have yet an API for the LGPN, but hopefully in the future we will have an API. But fortunately, thanks to the fact that we have the lemma, okay, in this resource, is possible to query it and to get the results. So in this case, I can consult the LGPN online and see where and when the name Archestratus in ancient Greek sources appear. Of course, the focus of the LGPN is not on authors, is an onomasticon, as Gabriel was saying before, and the LGPN is mainly focused on inscriptions and other material documents. Of course, you can find in the references. You can find references to literary sources, but the importance of the LGPN is that we have a collection of names attested mainly in inscriptions, for example, and in fact in this list you can find these references. The interesting thing is that, for example, I don't have the Archestratus I'm interested in, the fragmentary author in this case, which is another opportunity, for example, to expand the LGPN to include maybe in the future also fragmentary authors, small authors. But the idea is to use a resource like this for getting more information about the use of the name Archestratus in general in ancient Greek, and also for our interest in ancient author. Then we have other resources like by Gulick. I refer to an XML file of the edition of the Dapnosophist by Gulick, where we have also an annotation of name entities. And then another interesting resource that we can automatically consult, thanks to the lemma in ancient Greek, Archestratos, is this Index of Ancient Greek Lexica, where we have a collection of ancient Greek lexica, and here you have the list of these lexica, and we can automatically interrogate this resource, and then we will see that we find this name, for example, in the Suda, of course, and then possibly in other resources, and through this resource we can read also the text. And then finally, through the lemma, we can, of course, find our Archestratos also in the Virtual International Authority file, as I was saying before. So it's possible, okay, to, for example, for the Greek form, to find information in this resource. Then the digger includes also the inflected form, because this is what we have in our sources. Greek is an inflected language. And in this case, we can, for example, interrogate the TLG. Okay, I have to, okay, let's see if I can do that, because, okay, I have to log in with this machine, and so probably I have, okay, to go back to this, the inflected form. Okay, we can interrogate. In this case, we can use the, we can interrogate the database of the TLG, not the canon, also because the canon doesn't include the Greek form. For example, for the accusative of Archestraton, we can automatically interrogate the TLG for many different purposes, of course. And then we have other, in the digger, we have other links to the text where we can find occurrences of the name of Archestratos in the Deipnos office. The other resource I wanted to show you is the concordance. In this case, the aim of the concordance is different. So in this case, we want to see these entities in the text. This is a concordance, of course. Concordances were produced also before the digital revolution, before digital technologies, and in this case we have an example of a digital concordance where we can find, okay, as usual, the lemma of the author, but then for each inflected form of this name, we can see the occurrence in the text, okay, in this concordance, how this author name is mentioned by Athenaeus in the Deipnos Sophist, with other name entities in the text, which is, in this case, interesting, especially if you are interested in finding, for example, titles. And you can see that, for example, the title Gastronomia appears in different passages in the Deipnos Sophist together with the form Archestratos. And in this case, by identifying these entities, we can read them in the context, and then we can identify, for example, patterns about citations, how ancient authors were cited, okay, in the example of Athenaeus. But of course, the idea, sorry, is to use this data, these inflected forms, the lemma, and their disambiguation as name entities, to search other sources like the Suda, Horapocration, or many other authors in ancient Greek. And then my time is over. Okay, I would like just to mention, okay, the idea, okay, is to produce a set of data, and through the lemmatization, which is fundamental to query external resources, for generating a further disambiguation, and at the same time to contribute to these external resources, like, for example, also logeion, which is based on dictionaries where we miss many personal names, also the lexicon of Greek personal names where we miss author names, and Pleiades for place names, etc., etc. Okay, so this is the idea of the project. In the Digital Athenaeus, you can also find another experimental tool. Let me see, okay, which is the book stream. I don't talk about this because within the book stream you can find an experimental alignment of the Greek text with index entries, but I will skip that for now. And I would like just to show a final thing, because as for now, so the idea, first of all, is to extract single entities, and these extract single entities, inflect the forms of single entities, lemmatize them, get a further disambiguation, a first level of disambiguation, but then the problem is to connect name entities. And here I have an example, but I can immediately show this. This is an example of the text that I was mentioning before, where we have the passage with the name of Archestratos. The fact is that in ancient onomastics, of course, the name of a person is constituted by different elements. And in this case, we have an example where we have the name of Archestratos with two adjectives referring to the place of origin of Archestratos. So we have to connect these three forms, Archestratos, Syracusius, and Gelos, to get a real entity, because in this case we are referring to the ancient author. And in order to do that, there are different possibilities. As for now, I'm experimenting with annotations, with Inception, which is a web-based tool for performing annotations. And you can find sessions in Sunoikis is talking about Inception and showing how to use it. Inception is very flexible because we can perform semi-automatic annotations also with entity relations, which is the goal of this work. So to relate name entities in order to generate annotations of real entities. And in this case, you can see that I hope is, let me see if I can enlarge. In this case, maybe is better, because I know that, okay. And then, okay, in this case, you can see that we have different levels of annotation, because first of all, we have the name entity class. In this case, Archestratos is a person, but then we have a lock deriv for the two adjectives. We have the second level of annotation, which is the lemma. And then the third, which includes the three entities, is a URN identifying uniquely the author. And in this case, we're using the TLG number where our Archestratos is 1175. Inception can also include data from Wikidata. In this case, in the layer, you can see the name Archestratos, which is basically the entry from Wikidata, but behind this human readable form, we have the unique identifier of Wikidata, which is useful because from Wikidata, we can get many other metadata about the author and also links to other resources. And in this case, you can see, so I'm annotating the entire text with a unique identifier and then a further identifier from Wikidata. Okay, this was my last slide, and I understand that I put many things, but what I wanted to show is what is a concrete example for extracting concrete problems of digital philology, digital classes. So if today we miss data, in this case, we have the example of ancient Greek. We still miss data for inflected forms, for lemmata, and how can we get them? Because we have many digital versions of ancient sources, but and we also have linguistic annotations, but we miss, for example, the disambiguating part. And so this is the effort in the community to combine different projects. And today we have seen many projects, and then experiment with annotation and further disambiguation. Okay, so I think, so we were worried not to have enough material for today, but I think that we have a lot. So I don't know. So I see that when I was talking, I could see that in the chat was going on, and so I see comments in the chat. So I don't know if there are questions. Yes, I see. We will have, I mentioned the Digital Latin Library because today the focus was on Greek, at least on my part. And I didn't talk about the Digital Latin Library, but in our chat, Sam Husky, and hello, Sam, by the way. So he will contribute on July the 1st with a session about the Digital Latin Library. So we will have the opportunity also to know more about the catalog for Latin authors. But now, questions.
So I have a question which is maybe not so much a specific question about your content, Monica, but something that maybe all of us could have an opinion on, and it's simply to throw up a tension, as it were, between the existence of existing prosopographic and person databases and other data sets, which, such as onomasticons, gazetteers, and so forth, which help us to do NER, because we can look names up in them, and the instinct that a lot of us have when we start to see how good NER is, to say, well, why don't we just do really good NER across all of Greek literature and create a new prosopography? Forget all the published ones, create a completely new one from that. And the tension between those, I mean, is partly that we can't do that NER without building it on existing prosopographies and onomastica, which means the work is going to be slightly circular, which is not a bad thing, because work is circular, it's cyclical, right? We do things in cycles, but it does run the risk of not giving credit to the previous work and pretending we've invented it all. And I guess the same thing is just the discomfort with saying, do we really think that we can do better than generations, centuries of earlier scholars can do? My instinct is that a first pass at doing blind NER across the corpus of Greek literature is going to get us to 3/4 of the way to what 19th century German scholars did without computers. Right? So that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but I mean it means we're
That's the thing. So I have to say that in this case, I have a very practical problem, because my goal, or at least the goal of the community, is to produce something new, using new methods.
Yeah.
But the problem is that unless we want to annotate everything by hand, which is not what we want to do, because this is not a good use of the technologies, we have to start with something. And given that the machine doesn't disambiguate these forms, I tried to combine things. Okay, I used works done by past philologists, especially the philologists of the 19th century, because they did the good job, because they produced this list. They are already disambiguated list, a first set. I use this material, of course, because it was produced by scholars. And then I'm combining other methods. In my experience, at least, we have to combine manual and automatic methods, at least to get a first set of data. And then hopefully in the future, yes, have the machine to help us and to produce new views, okay, new perspectives, going beyond the traditional index scriptorum, which is a product of past philology. This is at least in my experience. So concrete practical problems, where do we want to start?
Yeah.
But of course, the goal is to go beyond traditional methods, because the technology is different.
I'm expecting Chiara to jump in on the subject of place names, because I think we probably had similar conversations before.
I did have a question for Monica regarding, I mean, all of what you said obviously resonates with me, and I completely agree on a variety of things, including what you just said about having to combine manual and automatic methods. Automatic methods are there to lead us to a suitable place where we don't have to do a ton of manual work, but then there is a certain type of philological intervention that requires to do something that technology is not yet capable of. And so I was fixating on one of your slides where you were talking about doing this sort of bottom-up semantic classification of named entities, starting from a very broad set of typologies and then going a little bit more into detail. And so I had a couple of questions about that. Are the semantic classes entirely bottom-up, or are they built on some vocabulary that is kind of general? And then there is a follow-up question, which is specifically for place names. I'm not sure if it's for also personal names. How do you assign those subtypes in a way that is, perfectly certain, if you know what I mean?
Yes. Well, first of all, this is the thing, because the instinct as a humanist is to jump into the text and look for specific things. This is what I wanted to avoid. This is the reason why, first of all, I used generic name entity classes. By this, I mean generic classes used in computational linguistics. They are used for many other projects, loc derive, per derive, etc. And we can identify them. Then the semantic subclasses that you can find in that slides, I didn't produce them, or at least they are based on a work done by Perseus in the past as an experiment for this text to identify, well, as an experiment again. We don't have an agreement in the community about those subclasses. For place names, I have to say that I will work on that later, so definitely we can discuss. So they are not, those subclasses are just to explain what we have within the big class of loc, but then we can discuss forever, and I hope that in the community we will have an agreement on classes to identify, I don't know, mountains, rivers, etc. And of course we know that the discussion is big and extremely complex. But my interest now is for author. Okay, within the personal class, I begin to identify authors first. We can agree on authors, and for disambiguating in them, I'm using TLG numbers and data from the Perseus catalog. So those identifiers that today the community is producing for classical authors. This is where I am now. So my effort always is to forget a bit that I am a humanist and a classicist, interested specifically in a text with its complexities, but start with generic categories and then go back to a specific problems. This is what I can say today.
Yeah.
But
I can add that Pleiades has a little bit of a vocabulary for place classification, although that's a conversation that I think should be ongoing, although that's a very, very good point to start.
Yeah, but again, for me, for example, for Pleiades, first, we need the forms, in this case in ancient Greek, because we miss them also in Pleiades. So let's start, at least a part of this contribution, let's start with collecting data, and then, of course, we expand the conversation about classifications. And for place names, it's a very complex discussion.
Okay, can I say something and maybe return the question back to prosopography and personal names? It's a question to both of the speakers and actually to all of the participants. This is something that was like a thin red line through all the presentation. The way we disambiguate persons. In name catalog or a bulk of text containing personal names. And for example, when Gabi discussed the LGPM project, which is really the gray zone between onomastics and prosopography, and this is an issue actually all the projects that deal with historical documents touch upon at one moment or another. What is the minimum ground to individuate and disambiguate a name occurrence in a text as a particular person? It could be, as LGPN does, maybe if we have several different names coming from several different regions, maybe the accompanying place name could help us disambiguate, but this is still not enough because you can have more than one Zeno living at Delos, for example. It could be relationships in a network. Say the Apollodoros, the father of this and this, or the son of this and this, but this is still not enough. Maybe this could be a person or a title. Christodoros, which is a priest, versus Christodoros, which is a grammarian or something, but still we can have more than one Christodoros, which is a grammarian. Do you think there could be a minimum ground zero for defining what makes a person across different projects, different data sets, different periods, and things like that?
So I have a certain amount of experience of trying to do that sort of disambiguation from the raw texts and from the data and existing data sets. And the short answer is no. The short answer is the only way you can completely disambiguate persons safely is by, firstly, a scholar deciding what the identities are, and secondly, the scholar or the project assigning unique permanent identifiers to each individual person, right? So there is a certain amount of what you say that can be done, and in practice, there's actually quite a lot that can be done. I had this experience with when we were ingesting the Lexicon of Weak Personal Names data, some 350,000 person records into the Snapdragon linked open data some years ago. We found that so the Lexicon has, you may remember, the where they have family relationships given in the other information field, which is under references. It'll say, you know, Xenon of Aphrodisias, 3rd century, son of Artemidorus, whatever. And so they've got a name in there. If you look in, so you say, okay, let's find the information about that Artemidorus, who's his father. So you flip to the page for Artemidorus, and you find that there are 12 Artemidoruses in this volume of LGPN. And you can probably figure out which one it is, but a computer will have a lot of difficulty figuring out which one it is. But so what I did was I tried to write a script, because we had obviously tens of thousands of such instances. And what I wanted to do was to actually disambiguate, to give the identifier of Artemidorus in the data, rather than just the name that the LGPN data we'd ingested gave. And so I wrote a script which said, okay, firstly, is there more than one Artemidorus in LGPN? If not, then let's assume it's him. If there's more than one, is there one of them that is from the same city as Xenon? And if there is only one from the same city, then let's assume it's him. If there's more than one, then let's look at date. Then let's look, and went on down the list. And actually, I didn't find any that weren't disambiguated by doing that, by figuring out that down the list. Until, and one of the things, the bottom line, which was the thing that the most of the time helped us disambiguate. This was the same way we were able to disambiguate people between the Lexicon of Weak Personal Names and Trismegistos, and the Lexicon of Weak Personal Names and Prosopography Imperial Romani, was by bibliography. If we know about this person because the Prosperography says they appear on line 3 of this inscription, then we're sure that this is the same record. We can't guarantee that 2 people mentioned on 2 different inscriptions are the same person, but we can guarantee that 2 different references to the same person in the same reference in the same inscription are the same person. Where that falls down is where Alexander, the son of Diomedes, the son of Alexander, all appears on one line of an inscription. We've got 2 Alexanders with the exact same bibliographical reference, including the line number in both cases. To a human, that's not difficult to disambiguate at all, but for the computer, it's very, very hard. So until someone's actually given them those identifiers, it's very hard to do so. So when I said the short answer to your question was no, the longer answer is yes, except for that one, very rare case when it's no. And I think the short answer is the only way we can be safe is when scholars have given them unique identifiers, which every single prosopography has, right? I mean, even if they're not currently machine readable identifiers, they are unique identifiers which can be made machine readable very easily.
Yeah. I also think that at some point we have to leave that level of ambiguity. We don't want the machine to classify everything. So this is a big risk. So we can agree again, personal name is difficult, but we can arrive to a certain level of agreement on a personal name. And this is the reason why I'm also using a past scholarship, for example, the indices, Indices Scriptorum. Then we can use the context, of course, and linguistic annotations may help. For example, in the case of authors, we can use verba dicendi, so we can find these forms. But this is something complex. But I think that at a certain level of ambiguity, we have to leave it. And then, of course, scholars using digital methods, and there is a big discussion about ontologies or how we annotate in different ways the same text can be done. This is at least where we are now, but I totally agree with Gabriel. And thank you, Mirko, because yes, what do we mean by personal name? And there are so many complexities. And also the machine can generate problems because, for example, Istros, a name of an ancient author, but also a river. Yeah. And for example, if accents and breathings are not represented in the same way in the Greek text, you can get wrong results from the LGPN. This is what I know by experience. I get the place in the LGPN instead of the name. But Gabby, please.
You probably can write complex scripts to check the context to see if it's for the river. But the question is it where the
exactly?
Or
I don't think.
You go and check. Yeah. Yeah. No, yeah.
I think Monica's exactly right that the ambiguity is important because sometimes scholars are not sure, or sometimes there's another kind of ambiguity, which I think I mentioned this last time. I don't remember if it was during the video or if it was when we were chatting after it. But in Jana's presentation, that when we were doing this disambiguation between the LGPN and Trismegistos, actually, I think I may have misread it, between the LGPN and PIR. And LGPN have one person reference, which is to say it's a name reference that they've given a number to each person with that name. And so their person number 7 with that name is given a bibliographical reference of PIR S 212 to 214, which means person 212, person 213, and person 214, 3 separate person records in PIR, are all considered to be one person in the LGPN. And when we looked at this, and we got the physical books out, and so we looked and we saw what they said about it, it wasn't that the scholars had different opinions about what was going on. It was that they had a different policy about how to separate out names. They all appeared in one inscription, and they may well have been the same person, but there was just some ambiguity as to whether one of them might have been the grandfather of another one, and it was a bit complicated. So because it was complicated, PIR said, let's have 3 identifiers, right? So that we can cite each of them individually, and we can say maybe the same as.
Yeah.
LGPN, by merging them all into a single identifier, meant you could no longer separate them out in that way. But it meant if all you were interested in was the names, there's probably just one person with that name. And so because they had slightly different agendas, they did slightly different things. That ambiguity we need to keep. And we can't just put in a same as statement saying this person is the same as that and that and that, because you'll start to end up making all sorts of false extrapolations based on that. And so that ambiguity is important and is never going to be resolved because scholars don't necessarily know the answer.
Yeah,
it's not going to be able to solve it for us.
But also because ancient texts meant to be ambiguous. This is the thing. So and we have to preserve that. I think they want to do it.
There is some sort of primordial ambiguity that you cannot go away with.
Yes, but also with citations. We are used to modern footnotes and complex citations where we have to be very precise, but in ancient times it was not like that because they have different purposes. They wanted to be ambiguous, etc., etc. I think this is something that we have to preserve. Of course, the machine is a bit more rigid and asks us to be very precise, or at least suffixed, but
well, it don't ask us to be precise if we've said we want to right. So but I mean this is exactly this is an example from a different domain, but it's like trying to tree bank a piece of text that has a play on words in it. There are 2 possible readings of the text, and both are essential, but the way we've written the tree bank vocabulary requires us to make a choice between them.
Exactly.
And that's a shortcoming of the vocabulary. It's an essential one, because in order to do the sort of linguistic querying we want, it has to have that inflexibility. And the same's true. You know, we have to give these people identifiers so we can do querying and extrapolation on it. But we lose some of that ambiguity, and so that has to somehow, you know, we have to think about: are we creating a system that is too inflexible? Can we put that ambiguity back in? And maybe that's just in commentary, and maybe we do what PIR did and say, here are three references, and actually the commentary says I think they're all the same person. Or we lose that ambiguity because, you know, as the LGPN do, because they think we don't need it at that point. And you can always, you know, go and read about it. But somewhere along the line, we've got to find some way to preserve that ambiguity, I think, as you say, exactly.
Okay, so I think so I was looking at, I hope that the audience, those are still live on YouTube, could follow us. But
Can I
okay.
highlight one of Sam's comments?
Yeah, of course.
Quickly. I mean, he makes a point that we've made, but I think he stresses the other half of it, which is that no matter how much we've automated, it's what we do with those results that matters, which is sort of the other half. We can't automate without the underlying information, and you know, we have to try and make sure we can preserve ambiguity, and we have to try and make sure that that we don't lose hundreds of years of scholarly expertise.
Yes.
Still, at the end of the day, it's not giving us answers. It's giving us information which can help us to ask more questions.
Yes, exactly. This is the goal of our work. So,
my favorite quotation from when I was a young digital humanities scholar was someone who said, you know, computers are not here to make our lives easier. They're here to make our lives harder. Which is true in some sense.
Yes, we can agree on that. Absolutely. And when we want to add the complexity of past scholarship, the situation gets even more harder. That's the problem, especially of this historical moment, okay, where we are between two ages. Okay, but now it's 6:45, at least in our time zone. So we have to close our session. And thank you, Mitko, thank you, Chiara, for joining us today. And thank you also to the audience for following us, for asking questions. As I said before, the class outline is in GitHub. You have 2 exercises. And you also have readings. Next week, we have a session about annotating geographical data with Recogito. So we will move to place names using Recogito, and we will talk about annotations, which is a topic strictly related to name entity recognition, and in this case to onomastics and prosopography. Okay, so that's it for today. Yes, of course, Gabriel.
A quick note to Yilin Liu about the question that they asked about for, you know, encoding citations and so forth. Ask that question again next week, because probably the 2 most qualified people in the world to answer that question will be here.
Yes, exactly. So please join us next week again at 5:15 p.m. Central European summertime for another great session. But as for now, so thank you. Have a good night. Have a good day, and see you next week. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.